Australia's military history is more than just a collection of dates and the locations of war-ravaged battlefields. It is the stories of service and sacrifice of those who have answered the call of their country of birth or adoption and the enduring legacy they have created. Join me as we look into one of those stories. I'm your host, Ross Manuel, and welcome to I Was Only Doing My Job, Australia's Military History, a Doc Network podcast. Now let's get started. G'day folks, and welcome to episode 67 of the podcast, recorded on the 19th of June 2024. This is the sixth and final episode that has been made in partnership with History Guild. Now, under normal circumstances, this would be the time that I would send you to check out our website or web store to pick up one of our now sold out morale patches. But instead, I recommend you check out historyguild.org and check out one of the hundreds of articles dedicated to educating people about Australia's contributions to the battles in Greece, Crete, and Malta. Now, so far in this series, I've given you an officer, a soldier, an airman, and a nurse. So let's finish the set and join me as I share with you the life, service, and legacy of a sailor, Richard Michael Pirrie. So let's get started. Richard Michael Pirrie was born on the 6th of June 1920 in the Melbourne suburb of Hawthorn. He was the eldest son of 6 children to Richard Francis Pirrie, a Victorian rules football player, and Isabel Agatha Pirrie. Known as Dick by his family, he attended Marist Brothers and St Patrick's College in East Melbourne, and there he showed his family's athletic ability, participating in running and Victorian rules football. At the completion of his schooling, he sat for the examination for the 3rd Division of the Commonwealth Public Service for work within the Defence Department, before going on to work for the Commonwealth Audit Office as a clerk. While there, he also started studying law. A staunch Christian, he was also a member of the Christian Young Men's Society and regularly sung in the church choir of his family's upbringing, while he also was a prefect. In 1940, Pirrie made his professional VFL debut in the last game of the regular season for the Hawthorn VFL Football Club. Despite being lauded in the Argus newspaper for a, quote, fine first appearance, unquote, Pirrie did not get a second run until round 8 of the following year, where his team lost to his father's old team, the Melbourne Demons. It wouldn't be until the final round of 1941 where he would have another run. At the completion of that regular season, Pirrie joined the Royal Australian Naval Volunteer Reserve, which meant by the time of the start of the 1942 season, he had already been called up for service. 2 of his younger brothers would also serve in the war. His brother Kevin James would serve in the Australian Imperial Force, and Andrew Lawrence would serve in the Royal Australian Air Force. On the 8th of September 1941, Pirrie presented to the Shore Installation and Training Depot, HMAS Cerberus, and after a period of training, he was posted to the Shore Installation HMAS Penguin in Garden Island in October. From there, he was seconded to the Royal Navy. He travelled to England aboard the transport ship, the venerable armed merchant cruiser SS Ceramic of the White Star Line. On arrival, his British colleagues quickly named him Digger. He would then be based in the London depot until the end of the year. Afterwards, he was posted to the stone frigate HMS Collingwood in Hampshire. Collingwood was a training facility responsible for the training of naval ratings and wireless telegraphy. This training would prove invaluable for his naval career. While there, he would also achieve the rating of ordinary seaman. At the completion of his training, he was assigned to the Shore Installation HMS Victory at Portsmouth while he awaited assignment to a sea posting. He wouldn't have to wait long, as on the 12th of May 1942, he'd be assigned to the destroyer depot ship HMS Tyne before joining the crew of the Type II Hunt-class destroyer escort HMS Middleton, as it was returning to duty from repairs. At this time, the Middleton was assigned to the Home Fleet. His first sea duty took him to the Arctic Sea, serving as part of the screen along with the battleship HMS Duke of York, the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious, His Majesty's cruisers Liverpool, Kent, London, Nigeria, and Norfolk, along with His Majesty's destroyers Blankeny, Eclipse, Escapade, Faulkner, Fury, Icarus, Inglefield, Lamerton, Marne, Oslo, Orabai, and Wheatland, covering the return of British warships escorting convoys to and from Russia. The Arctic convoys were a series of 78 ocean-going convoys which sailed from the United Kingdom, Iceland, and North America to Russian ports, in particular Archangel and Murmansk, in response to Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union with the launch of Operation Barbarossa in June 1941. These convoys were a demonstration of the Allied commitment to the Soviet Union prior to the establishment of a second front. Equipment from the United Kingdom was sent to Russia via the Anglo-Soviet Agreement, while equipment from the United States was sent via the Lend-Lease Agreement. In total, approximately 1,400 merchant vessels, organised in twice-monthly transits, delivered essential supplies to the Soviet Union, keeping them in the fight until the Western Allies could open a second front. On the 23rd of May, HMS Middleton served as part of a screen comprising of the battleships HMS Duke of York and USS Washington, the carrier HMS Victorious, and the heavy cruisers HMS London and USS Wichita, sitting sentinel over arriving and departing convoys. At the start of June, HMS Middleton had been released from the home fleet and was sent to Gibraltar to join Force X to participate in Operation Harpoon, which was a blockade run on Malta. As mentioned in the previous episode, Malta's strategic importance during the Second World War became more prevalent as the war in the Mediterranean progressed, mainly due to its central location between the British strongholds of Gibraltar and Alexandria. Before the war, it was a useful way station with convoys and trade routes bound for Egypt, the Suez Canal, India, and the Pacific. During the war, its proximity between Sicily and North Africa made it a vital forward base for launching attacks on Axis shipping and land bases in the central Mediterranean, while also supporting Allied operations in Greece and Crete. Thus, whoever held the island could heavily influence the conduct of the North African campaign. The issue with that, as Malta is an island, it was heavily dependent on convoys being escorted by the Royal Navy from Alexandria to sustain the civilian population with food and raw materials, as well as the military garrison with fuel, equipment, and ammunition. And while the Royal Navy had some early successes in 1940 and 41 against the Italian Navy, the arrival of German forces in the region and the massive air and sea campaign launched against it resulted in the destruction of a lot of key infrastructure, which gave the local authorities the impression that they were planning to invade. This was compounded by the collapse of the Greece and Crete campaign, which allowed Italian and German aircraft greater access to Malta. By April 1942, German bombing raids had destroyed docks, ships, aircraft, and airfields, and then they shifted their focus to targets preliminary to an invasion: camps, barracks, warehouses, and road junctions. For some reason, though, after the 18th of April, German bombing suddenly stopped and Italian bombers took over, regularly bombing with small formations of aircraft. During the month, Axis aircraft flew more than 9,500 sorties and demolished or damaged 11,450 buildings. 300 civilians were killed and 350 were severely wounded. The destruction of warehouses and stores soon resulted in critical shortages of supplies, food, medical equipment, and ammunition. Fortunately for the people of Malta, the losses sustained to German forces during the Greece and Crete campaigns, coupled with Hitler's poor opinion of the Italian Navy and the successes of the Afrika Korps in recapturing Tobruk, put an end to any plans to land Axis forces on Malta. Instead, the decision was made to isolate Malta from the Allies and to bomb it into submission to deny its use. That didn't give the Maltese people much comfort, who still had to endure the constant bombings, the deprivations, the death, and the near starvation brought on by that Axis powers blockade. One of the biggest issues plaguing the supply of Malta was that the Royal Navy was engaged in several theatres simultaneously, and the United States Navy was also otherwise occupied. And with the threats imposed by German, Italian, and Japanese air and sea forces, that meant there was simply not enough service vessels to escort every convoy. And it was at this point in the war that it was well established that, with very few exceptions, an unescorted convoy was a sunk convoy. With Royal Navy destroyers and cruisers conducting anti-submarine escorts of the Atlantic convoys, to the battleships and aircraft carriers that were required to punch their way through to the Arctic Ocean to supply the Soviet Union, this meant that despite the Allies controlling both ends of the Mediterranean, the substantive air superiority the Axis powers had over the centre became so intense that all available freight bound for Egypt or the Indian Ocean and the Pacific had to be sent via either the Panama Canal or the Cape of Good Hope. The situation became so dire that for the start of 1942, 3 convoys went to Malta and only 5 merchant vessels made it, of which 3 were sunk in port. In March of 42, the British convoy from Alexandria, destined for Malta, had been intercepted by the Italian Navy at the Second Battle of Sirte, and while the Royal Navy destroyers that were escorting it were able to fend off the attack, they sustained damage as a result. This engagement caused enough of a delay to the convoy that when it sailed into Malta's Grand Harbour, it did so during the day, which meant it was unloading as Axis bombers descended on the harbour. This raid resulted in the entire convoy being sunk in port and 5,100 tons of supplies being sent to the ocean floor. As a result, communiques reached Malta stating they would have to hold out until June, as the British Chiefs of Staff ruled that because the Italian fleet could be expected to sail to meet any force bound for Malta, British battleships and carriers would need to be deployed to escort it, which at the time weren't available as they were engaged in other theatres. Aside from the flight of Spitfires that arrived with Adrian Goldsmith and Royal Navy submarine and fast mine layers which were able to deliver much needed anti-aircraft ammunition and fuel, the risk was too great for any more convoys with more critical supplies. It was also determined that by June, the situation in North Africa would be clarified. At the start of 1942, Erwin Rommel launched an attack eastward against an overextended British Eighth Army, which pushed them back beyond Benghazi. This was immediately followed up by another offensive in May when Rommel, initially halted by strong mine defences of the Gazala line, bypassed Allied positions to retake Tobruk and push the British forces back across the Egyptian border. With the arrival of a new commander of Middle Eastern forces, Lieutenant General Sir Harold Alexander, and a new commander of the Eighth Army, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery, it was hoped that they could stop Rommel's advance long enough to allow convoys to travel without the need of a heavy escort, which would then allow these assets to be sent to Malta. This is why on the 5th of June, HMS Middleton joined a force comprising of His Majesty's cruisers Kenya and Liverpool, His Majesty's destroyers Onslow, Icarus, Escapade, Bedouin, Marne, Matchless, Ithriel, Blankney, Partridge, Badsworth, and a Polish destroyer, the Orp Kujawik, at Clyde in England. This force, dubbed Force X, was part of Operation Harpoon, which was the eastward drive across the Mediterranean from Gibraltar, which coincided with Operation Vigorous, which was part of the larger Operation Julius, which was a westward drive from Alexandria. The intention was that both simultaneous convoys would force the Italian Navy to split their forces and would increase the likelihood of at least one of them making it to Malta. Harpoon comprised of 6 merchant vessels under the close escort of Force X, along with the anti-aircraft cruiser HMS Cairo, minesweepers and support vessels, and indirectly supported by the battleship HMS Malaya and the carriers HMS Argus and Eagle, with 3 cruisers and 8 destroyers escorting them. Vigorous, the larger of the 2 convoys, consisted of 12 merchant ships with 12 destroyers and corvettes in close escort and a screen of 8 cruisers and 14 destroyers. By the 13th of June 1942, both convoys had left their respective harbours bound for Malta, and both were immediately spotted by Italian and German agents, and their locations dispatched to their respective commands. By the time that Harpoon force reached the Sicilian Channel, they were engaged by an Italian force comprising of 2 cruisers and 5 destroyers. While both forces were evenly matched, the fact that Force X was tasked with protecting a convoy, it was more restricted, and as a result suffered heavily. As the British warships laid a smokescreen to try and hide the convoy, the battle would be soon joined by German aircraft, and after 9 hours of constant fighting, the battle was over. Italian service vessels suffered minor damage. The British, however, suffered horribly, with HMS Cairo damaged, 2 destroyers sunk and 3 more damaged. The bigger issue was that of the 6 transports attached to the convoy, 4 would be sunk in the battle. Vigorous suffered even further as they were jumped by a force of Italian battleships and cruisers and had to limp back to Alexandria with none of their cargo making it. Captain Hardy, the commanding officer of Force X, decided that what remained of his force was to continue on to Malta, and as a result, 2 transports managed to limp ashore and deliver much needed supplies to the Maltese people. After spending a day in port, HMS Middleton was then detached to escort the heavily damaged HMS Liverpool back to Gibraltar, and as a result, Middleton would return to the main Royal Navy Fleet Base on Scapa Flow on the 18th of June. This autumn, I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian military history podcast, has partnered with History Guild to bring you a series of episodes dedicated to telling the life, service and legacy of 4 Australians of the tens of thousands who served in the Mediterranean theatre during the Second World War, playing a vital role in that theatre. History Guild has created this project so more Australians can discover the stories of service and sacrifice of the Australians who fought there and honour them by visiting these battlefields. The History Guild website, historyguild.org, has guides to help people visit and understand the battlefields in Greece, Crete and Malta. So thanks, History Guild, for the support. On return to England, Pirrie was interviewed by the Sydney Daily Mirror, who published an article on the 27th of July that said, quote, "I never expected to be back here. It was just 6 days and nights of sheer hell," unquote. It also listed that he would be going for a commission shortly. He also wrote home saying, quote, "We were bombed from dawn to dusk and at night subs attacked us. The torpedo bombing, dive bombing and high-level bombing lasted for 2.5 days going. We stopped today at Malta and were bombed there. On the return voyage, we were bombed by another 2.5 days. The whole crew was utterly exhausted. We had been firing continuously while it was daylight and had no sleep and little to eat for 6 days and nights, and our ammo was nearly gone," unquote. On American Independence Day, the 4th of July, 1942, Pirrie and HMS Middleton were once again on the Arctic convoy run, joining the heavy covering force comprising of the battleships Duke of York and Washington, the carrier HMS Victorious, His Majesty's cruisers Cumberland and Nigeria, the His Majesty's destroyers Ashanti, Blankney, Marne, Escapade, Falconer, Martin, Onslaught, Oslo, and Wheatland, along with the United States destroyers USS Marriott and Rhind, to provide cover for departing and returning convoys bound for Russia. However, the threat of attack by the German battleship Tirpitz and the heavy cruisers Admiral Scheer and Lutzow, which were believed to be operating in the region, caused the outbound convoy to scatter, and as the screening force was diverted to intercept the supposed German surface vessels, though in doing so, it left it vulnerable to attack by the Luftwaffe and U-boats. This resulted in only 11 of the 35 transports reaching their destination. The destruction of most of convoy PQ-17 damaged Anglo-Soviet relations as the USSR refused to accept that so many merchant vessels could be sunk in one convoy, but it also soured Anglo-American naval relations as it was the first convoy to have US Navy warships under British command. It resulted in the United States Naval Task Force being reassigned to the Pacific. Pirrie would depart HMS Middleton on the 15th of July 1942 as it was back in Scapa Flow before it departed to Murmansk for the rest of the year. He'd be assigned to the shore installation HMS Victory once again, and in October, he would be accepted at HMS King Alfred, which was the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve Training Depot, to undertake the training required to be commissioned as an officer within the Royal Navy. Training at King Alfred consisted of 10 weeks training, which was split between 3 separate training facilities, 2 of these being requisitioned private boarding schools. At completion of this training in November, Pirrie was assigned to the London depot for additional training at the Royal Naval College in Greenwich, and on the 12th of December 1942, Richard Michael Pirrie was commissioned as sub-lieutenant in the Royal Australian Navy Volunteer Reserve. The following day, he was posted to the Command Operations Training Centre, HMS Quebec, on the banks of Loch Fyne in Scotland. While there, he trained in the maintenance and use of landing craft. From there, Pirrie was posted to the shore installation HMS Copra at the end of June 1943, where he spent the rest of the year. HMS Copra, like Quebec, was a shore installation attached to Combined Operations. Its name is actually an acronym for Combined Operations, Pay, Records and Accounts, and is located in Largs on the River Clyde near Glasgow. His posting to Copra was for administrative purposes, as he was assigned once more to the Mediterranean, commanding a landing craft to participate in Operation Husky, the Allied invasion of Sicily. His particular assignment was to take a landing craft support, or LCS, equipped with an artillery forward observer, as close as possible to the shore to coordinate self-propelled artillery and naval gunfire support onto Axis fortifications on the beach. At the completion of the North African campaign and the destruction of the Italian and German forces there, between the might of the British and American armies, the Allies turned their attention to the quote-unquote soft underbelly of Europe, and under pressure from the Soviet Union about opening a second European front, decided to invade the continent via Italy, with the first step being Sicily. Brought on by the success of the deception operation, Operation Mincemeat, the Allied invasion of Sicily took 6 weeks and suffered minor casualties, starting on the night of the 9th of July 1943, amidst strong winds and difficult seas and unexpected offshore sandbars. Pirrie was able to skip his LCS where it needed to be to provide better gunfire support for the men going ashore. At the completion of Operation Husky, he also participated in Operation Baytown, which was the Allied invasion of mainland Italy. Pirrie would return to South Hampshire on the 12th of April 1944, when he was assigned to the shore installation HMS Cricket, which was the Royal Marine Landing Craft Crew training base. He brought with him the experience he learned in the invasion of Sicily in Italy for the grandest stage of it all, the Allied invasion of northwestern New France, Operation Overlord. On the 5th of June 1944, the eve of the Allied invasion, Pirrie started writing the following letter to his family, quote, "My dearest mother, dad, and boys. Well, my dears, the pressure is now on, and soon, as the weather improves, we sail for the greatest event in the history of the world. By the time you receive this, you will surely have heard some of the bare details. This is the greatest armada that has ever formed. A colossal feat of organization, the product of years of planning and hard work. Yesterday morning, our chaplain came aboard and with the soldiers, Canadians, and received general absolution. If anything happens, it is just the will of the Sacred Heart. I will leave this and hope and trust in God that I will conclude it in a few days," unquote. Sadly, Pirrie would never get the chance to finish that letter. For the Allied invasion, Sub-Lieutenant Richard Pirrie was assigned to LCS M47, serial 1055, of the 510th Royal Marine Assault Flotilla, attached to HMS Invicta, a converted cross-channel passenger ferry turned troopship carrying the 7th Canadian Infantry Brigade. Pirrie was tasked with delivering 4-man team of the 13th Canadian Field Regiment's Bombardment Forward Observation Group, as well as an officer, as close as possible to the German fortifications at the Atlantic Wall overlooking Juno Beach to relay coordinates to the 105mm M7 self-propelled gun carriages of the 13th Canadian Field Regiment, and as a result, he was in the first wave of landing craft streaming towards the beach. As observed by the Sydney Daily Mirror correspondent Robert Raymond, quote, He went ahead of the invasion force, but as the barrage was really getting going, Digger's little craft lying in full view of the enemy batteries caught a direct hit from an 88mm shell, which killed him and the major and most of the crew. Digger never had a chance, but the Canadians fighting ashore today know what he did and won't forget it, unquote. Now, according to official accounts, Pirrie's landing craft simultaneously struck a floating sea mine at the same time it was hit by the 88mm shell. And of the 11-man crew, only Pirrie, the artillery major whose name has sadly been lost to history, the coxswain, leading seaman Taylor, and another seaman were killed. The stokers and the rest of the Canadians on board were all miraculously flung clear and managed to make it to the beach. The 6th of June 1944 was Sub-Lieutenant Richard Michael Pirrie's 24th birthday, and he has the distinction of being the first Australian killed on D-Day. 12 other Australians would also be killed on the Day of Days, and while most people would be unaware of Australia's contributions to the invasion, about 3,300 Australians were directly involved, with 2,800 members of the Royal Australian Air Force, 500 members of the Royal Australian Navy like Richard Pirrie, and 13 officers of the Australian Imperial Force that actually landed with British troops on D-Day. Thomas Langford, a lieutenant in the Royal Navy Volunteer Reserve, wrote to Pirrie's mother, quote, "Dear Mrs. Pirrie, it is with infinite regret that I write to you on so tragic an occasion. May I, for myself and on behalf of my fellow officers, offer deepest sympathy to you and your family. It may comfort you to know that Richard's death was instantaneous. His craft had been detailed for a very dangerous duty close on the enemy coast. This included spotting for seaborne artillery on our sector and thus covering the landing of the first flight of troops. So courageously and efficiently had this been done that on our portion of the beach, not one of our troops failed to get a supply ashore. Your son's craft was about to land his military personnel when she was hit by a mine and an enemy shell at the same time. The whole flotilla is deeply grieved by the loss of so dearly loved and much respected friend. His friendly nature, cheerful, willful devotion to all of his duties, and his firm belief in the ultimate good of all things made him an officer with whom we are all proud to have served," unquote. Pirrie's body was never recovered, and he was initially commemorated on the Plymouth Naval Memorial, which lists the names of the 15,993 sailors of the British Commonwealth who were lost at sea, and on the Roll of Honour of the Australian War Memorial in Canberra. Sub-Lieutenant Richard Michael Pirrie was also posthumously mentioned in dispatches. The citation read, quote, "For gallantry, skill and determination, and undaunted devotion to duty during the initial landing of Allied forces on the coast of Normandy, and for his gallantry, leadership and determination, for his conduct and bearing greatly encouraged his men," unquote. To mark the 80th anniversary of the D-Day landings, Pirrie's name was also added to the Normandy Memorial Wall in Portsmouth, England. By all accounts, Richard Pirrie didn't fear what was coming. He wrote to his family that if it was his time to come, it would have been God's will. His service and his sacrifice meant that while he did give up his today, he gave so many more soldiers under his stewardship their tomorrow, and for that we, and a lot of Canadian families, are eternally grateful. This marks the conclusion of our collaboration with History Guild, and I want to thank David Phillipson and the History Guild team for the opportunity to share these amazing stories of service and sacrifice with you all. Also, a huge thank you to Dr. Lachlan Grant, Senior Historian at the Australian War Memorial, for his help in deciphering Pirrie's service record, and to Hans Houteman from the Unit History's website for filling in the gaps in his story. Articles for this episode are Australian Hero Commemorated on the 80th Anniversary of D-Day interview with Michael Pirrie by ABC Radio National, the website of the Arctic Convoy Museum, the Arctic Convoy Club of New Zealand, the British Normandy Memorial, players killed on active service, and Issue 6 2020 of the AFL record by the Australian Football League, Royal Australian Navy in the Atlantic and Mediterranean by the Department of Veterans Affairs, the Second World War nominal rolls of Richard Pirrie, Kevin James Pirrie, and Andrew Lawrence Pirrie, and honouring Richard Pirrie on the 80th anniversary of D-Day by the Department of Veterans Affairs, A Forgotten Front, the Mediterranean Blockade of the First World War by Heather James, which was surprisingly useful for the Second World War, the Mediterranean Convoys 1943-44, and Combined Operations Small Craft Scale Drawings by the United States Naval History and Heritage Command, HMS Invicta by U-Boat.net, War of Supply, World War II's Allied Logistics in the Mediterranean by David D. Dvorak, D-Day Commemorations Honouring Those Who Served by Mike Hughes, D-Day Commemorations Honouring Those Who Served by Lieutenant Commander John Thompson of the Australian Department of Defence, Mediterranean Convoys in World War II by Commander M.A. Bragdagan, Italian Naval Reserve, Sub-Lieutenant Richard Pirrie, MiD by the Navy Victoria Network, North American Campaigns by the Encyclopedia Britannica, which is still very useful, the Combined Operations website, the Wartime Memories Project website, Australia in the Battle of Normandy, They Also Served, Why D-Day Matters to Australia, the Royal Australian Navy at Normandy and On the Great Crusade by Dr. Lachlan Grant, the RAN on D-Day by the Naval Historical Society of Australia, the Hawthorn Football Club, the Struggle for North Africa 1940-43 by the National Army Museum, Operation Overlord Force J, Juno Beach Landing Table by Patrick Ellie, Trove, the online newspaper archive from the National Library of Australia, the Malta Convoys from the Torpedo Bay Museum, the service record of Sub-Lieutenant Richard Pirrie, Operation Vigorous and Operation Harpoon, and the Naval Battle of Palantiera by Commander Supremo Italy in World War II, a final letter to the family by the Melbourne Age from the 5th of June 2004, the Naval History website entry on HMS Middleton, Operation Harpoon by the Lancaster University, the website of the Imperial War Museum, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission, the last post ceremony of Sub-Lieutenant Richard Pirrie, We Sail for the Greatest Event in the History of the World by Claire Taylor, and the website of the Australian War Memorial. I was only doing my job, and the Australian Military History Podcast is made possible thanks to the generous support from each and every one of you, but especially to the members of our Armoured Emu Brigade community. Now, if you want to continue the conversation or suggest a topic for a future episode, you can do so on all our social media channels. At this point, the podcast is on everything under @IWODMJ. Links to everything are in the show description. If you want to join the Armoured Emu Brigade community, you can also do so on our Discord server. The invite link to that is on the episode description and on the podcast website, www.thedocnetwork.net. There you can find also show notes, transcripts, and photos of my various travels that are locating the myriad of memorials dotted around Australia. If you like what I do here on the podcast and want to directly support the work that I do, you can either buy the podcast a one-off coffee or support us on Patreon for exclusive podcasts, interviews, and giveaways. Each cent raised goes directly into improving the podcast, from digitization of service records and the purchasing of reference material to the distribution and licensing of each and every piece of content. But the best thing you can do is rate this episode on your platform of choice, leave a review, or share it with a friend. It's the easiest way to show your support and get the show into the ears of people who need to hear it. Thanks for listening to I Was Only Doing My Job, an Australian Military History Podcast, a Doc Network production. This episode was recorded on the lands of the Ngunnawal people, whose elders have passed on knowledge for thousands of years, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. This podcast is mostly a one-man show, with me doing the writing, researching, recording, audio engineering, and directing, with additional research done by Laurie Favell of My Silent Hero. All opinions expressed in this episode are solely those of the speaker and do not represent the opinions or views of any agency, entity, or organization. It is licensed under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial Share-alike 4.0 International License. And until next time, friends, catch you then. Bye!